Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Norwood. I'm the Programme Director at Tradition. And I'm going to spend the next 15-20 minutes just talking through a subject that I live and breathe on a daily basis, which is chaos. I think everyone in here probably agrees with me that change, uncertainty and chaos is a way of life nowadays, particularly so with kind of events like Brexit around the corner. And whilst I can't claim to know what's going to happen come Thursday, I'm hoping that I can give you an insight into terms of how to manage some chaos in your environments and projects. So just some quick definitions. Project delivery, I'm sure you're all familiar with this description. It's pretty explicit, scientific, nothing unusual. Quality, and it's really, in terms of the word, kind of implicit, and expectations where we start to see some subjectivity kind of coming into the equation. And then chaos. And even for me, just the definition of chaos looks chaotic, but kind of key principles about complex systems, unpredictable nature, and that kind of sensitivity to small changes, which are important. So just bear those in mind as we kind of go through. So I'm just going to touch upon some of the contributing factors to chaos and what creates a chaotic environment, some of those things to look out for in your workplaces, in your projects, in your teams, and there's some of the symptoms that will give you an indication of how chaotic your environment is. And then I'll touch on some of the things that, the tools and things that I use to try and survive in that chaotic environment. And at the end, obviously, hopefully some time for some Q&A. But if anybody has any questions during the presentation, let me know. So kind of what drives chaos? At a kind of industry sector, we kind of, if you consider the amount of change, the pressures we have to deliver, the risk appetite being higher than other sectors, the financial, banking world is actually up in that top right-hand quadrant compared to some of the other sectors that are out there. So even at an industry level, we're kind of influenced a lot by those attributes that create chaos. At a kind of product technology level, we've got the kind of diversification within our sector, whether we're talking about exchange-traded products, OTC, the different transactional methods, whether we're talking about voice and hybrid versus purely electronic, whether we've got cleared or not cleared products, etc. We've got client diversity and the kind of difference between the needs of institutional clients and retail clients, big corporate organisations versus the startups we're seeing. We've obviously got a lot of diversity in the regulatory requirements around the globe as well. At the software level, I'm sure it's been touched on a lot today, but we've got a plethora of different languages that create variety and complexity in our environments, as well as the development and delivery tools. And the fact is we're dealing with very complex logical problems that have a lot of data, things like latency and performance, capacity, reliability all come into the mix. At a hardware level, it's often overlooked, but there's, I think because of its kind of tangible, more kind of explicit nature, people kind of ignore the kind of layers of complexity that come in with kind of hardware, and particularly, when we start looking at different expectations from the business to commoditize things in the cloud, and an expectation of kind of reducing costs around that, and some of the challenges around these areas that are kind of blurring the lines between development and hardware, where we talk about embedded programming at the hardware level. I know there's been some discussion on that today. And then the testing side, we've touched on the fact that there's never enough coverage. You always can test more. And how do we combat some of those challenges? The kind of the multi-layer kind of demands of our testing nowadays, and balancing functional and non-functional, performance, capacity and security and disaster recovery. And then the Swiss Army of tools that we need to be able to actually test our systems appropriately. So, lots of influencing factors there to consider. And on top of all that, we've also got these things called people, who are particularly complex in nature as well. At the individual level, we've got people with their kind of beliefs, their values, their own skills, things they're good at, things they're not. At a team level, we've got behaviours to consider, and that can be across a kind of technology team within an organisation, or it can be between teams in different organisations, and the kind of company cultural values that come into play there. And then in this global market we live in now, where we're relying on teams and skills around the globe, you've got to take into consideration the cultural barriers and language barriers that come into play in some of those social aspects. So again, another layer of the kind of complexity onion that helps drive chaos in our environments. So trying to recognise whether you're in a kind of chaotic environment, some of these symptoms are pretty obvious, and they almost become kind of the standard, the norm nowadays. But I'd encourage you to maybe just step back and consider whether some of these things are kind of touching your teams or your workplace today, and challenge to actually understand what may be driving it, because that way you can understand where you may need to focus some of your effort in controlling some of this chaos. So at a technology level, overly complex systems where there's limited innovation, high rates of defects, and unstable operations in production. On the people front, long hours, people working all hours to get the project delivered on time, the change implemented. Poor collaboration and trust between teams, and high staff turnover. And at kind of project level, we talked about those missed deliverables, high levels of rework, ever increasing costs, and low levels of continuous improvement. I mean, it's obviously quite difficult to kind of qualify chaos, by its nature. It is unpredictable and nebulous in nature. But what I try to do is actually look at those areas that are important to the project and the environment you're in, and try and think about what would be considered a steady state, kind of normal operating procedure, or something you feel in control of versus where you may not feel so control. So, we talk about requirements and being well defined versus exploratory in nature. The speed we're expected to deliver change. Some of the other examples here in terms of consider the complexity of the organisation you're working in, and whether you're dealing with a co-located team versus a very dissipated team with all those cultural and language challenges I touched on before. So survival. My first kind of thing that I try to embrace and just recognising you can't really control chaos. It's going to happen. You just have to face it, and really it's trying to kind of adopt a way of thinking and a mindset that helps you to deal with those obstacles that are going to come. So expect uncertainty, and kind of realise there's often little or no relationship between the cause and effect in chaos. So don't focus too much about trying to find the root cause of problems, but focus on looking ahead and how you can adjust to the chaos that's happening. Remember, I kind of talked about one of those definitions of chaos is those small changes to being very sensitive to small changes. So it's important to kind of manage through small iterations, anticipate and adapt as you go along, and that's why things like Agile and some of the points that Alexei talked about in his QA principles are so important in terms of moving through things in small iterations, being able to anticipate what's lying ahead. Big thing is make sure you have contingency plans. Thinking about how you're going to resolve a problem when that problem happens is too late by then. Things have moved on, and you're going to suffer. It's have those contingency plans and what-if scenarios in your back pocket, and think about those up front. It's well worth the time investing in it. And challenge the assumptions that everybody's making on your project team, whether it's about the tools you're using to test, or whether it's about the resources you're expecting to have on your project, or whether it's about certain milestones you're trying to achieve. Challenge them, get your peers to challenge them, because if you have a robust set of assumptions, you're more likely to be able to hit those than if they're weak. Let's try and keep it simple and be agile. I think it's all too easy in today's world to kind of deal with this complex situation by trying to develop new methodologies and be particularly innovative about solving problems. But often I think actually paring it back and keeping it simple is more important, and actually getting your team to focus their efforts on on trying to understand how these variables and things that influence the environment can be managed, as opposed to worrying too much about process and overly complex systems. So as Dee Hock, the founder of Visa, said, I think it really does ring true to me anyway. And from an agile perspective, again, I very much see it as adopting that as a philosophy, as a way of thinking, and not so much worrying too much about the mechanics of the process. And again, coming to that point about being able to react quickly to change. Synchronize your activities. With all these different kind of elements to the way we have to deliver technology in our trading systems today, it's really important that our teams are in sync. It was a good point that's brought up before about how often testing is actually now the pacemaker of how we deliver our kind of projects. But understanding that is so important, because it's that way you can then manage those influencing factors to your benefit. And in this kind of world of kind of chaos, it's less about kind of planning, doing and controlling, but more about acting and sensing and understanding how your environment is reacting to those changes you're making, and then responding accordingly. And just the point on the bottom is avoid that domino effect that one problem in a particular area knocking on to another. It's really important to understand you may have kind of chaos in one area, and trying to control it from spreading and becoming contagious. And managing what I call that kind of technical debt over time, which is, in today's environment, we're often forced to cut corners, make compromises in our architecture, compromises in our testing, etc. And over time, that kind of builds up, and at some point it gets to a point where you've got a system that can't be supported, it's too architecturally complex to do anything about, or you've built up too many bugs in the system that then start to come to light with the complexity of the system. So the key point there is you've got to build in an element of kind of maintenance into this very agile approach that you may be adopting in your project delivery. Other key point that's fundamentally is dependencies. I mean, again, dependencies exist everywhere, and it's that kind of influence of a change over here impacting something over here, and it is very difficult to manage dependencies, particularly when at a kind of hardware level there can be tens of thousands of parameters. Configuration management is often maybe strong at a kind of software development level, but then when it comes to transitioning that knowledge into production and operations teams, it can be very poor. We touched upon about how often, at a functional level, defects may not manifest themselves in that kind of simple, in those simple scenarios. But when you then overlay some load or some failure into the system, how those functional issues then flush to the surface. So understanding the dependencies between those functional elements of your system and the non-functional are critical, and as are some of the project deliveries, and really understanding the inputs and outputs of your teams is essential for, again, making sure that those teams are in sync and working together. Data, it is as important as ever when it comes to dealing with chaos. I mean, part of the problem is there's so much data out there at the moment that often it's difficult to understand what to do with it. And quite often, people are making the wrong decisions of it. But try and challenge what data you're collecting and how you're using it. If you don't think your data is good quality, improve it. If you're not capturing stuff you think that may be important, go and capture it, even if it's basic metrics. Try and use that to then identify patterns of what may be happening and understand how, what's the impact of those small changes we talked about earlier on. And again, the idea is to use that data to be able to drive and inform your decisions, so you can make quick decisions, check the impact, and adjust accordingly. There's some advanced strategies out there. I don't know if it's been kind of covered today, but I guess the mini robots is an element of it. But there's this concept that the Netflix have introduced around kind of chaos engineering and testing, where their kind of whole design philosophy is failure is inevitable. So embrace it and deliberately introduce failure into your system. So they have this concept of monkeys. So you have these latency monkeys that basically inject latency into your system and monitor how the system performs in that environment. Security monkeys, which look for security weaknesses and try to exploit components that may have that, and then take them down and see how the system reacts to it. My favourite, the janitor monkey, which looks at unused processes in the system, again removes them to understand the impact it may have on your trading system or another. There's also some interesting topics around extreme project management, and Doug DiCarlo is a bit of a thought leader in this subject. And if you're interested in some of the kind of management and leadership techniques to deal with this chaotic world we live in today, I'd encourage you to maybe go and have a read of his book as well. So in summary, chaos is everywhere. Never more so in the finance and technology sector. I'd encourage you to embrace it. It's important that you understand your environment and what may be influencing that chaos. It's different for every firm. Don't just consider the technology elements of it, but consider the kind of the softer issues as well. And to combat it, adopt that agile and flexible mindset. Look ahead, anticipate what may be coming, and try and use whatever data you can to support your decision process. Thank you.